Welcome to EJIL Live. EJIL Live is the official podcast of the European Journal of International Law. And today we're coming to you from Victoria University of Wellington Faculty of Law in Wellington, New Zealand. And we're talking with Dr. Deborah Whitehall, who is a lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne. And we'll be discussing Deborah's article, A Rival History of Self-Determination, which explores the thinking of Rosa Luxemburg on self-determination. Deborah's article is published in volume 27, issue 3 of the European Journal of International Law. So, Dr. Whitehall, welcome.
Thank you.
Perhaps we could just begin by talking about how you came to this topic. Rosa Luxemburg is a name that some international lawyers may have heard, but many may not have heard of, and certainly not in connection with self-determination. She doesn't necessarily appear on all the international law syllabuses where we talk about self-determination. So perhaps you could just say a few words about how you came to the topic.
Yes, well, thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation to join you here and talk about Rosa Luxemburg. Well, I wondered about how I came, and I arrived at Rosa Luxemburg and this particular question very intuitively, and so that there are many different ways I arrive here. And I suppose I was very interested in my research about international law and particularly human rights and the history of human rights. And I noticed that there was a lot of attention to the minorities regimes and how we understand that, and also how we understand ourselves and our timeline as international lawyers. And I was just wondering that when there's international historians and international lawyers are talking about the minorities regimes after World War I, was there anything else to say? And it seemed to be quite full and explored, and there were so many tremendous voices occupying this space in time. And I wondered, well, was that the entire story? Was there something else that has been left out? And I started wondering about what was left out and how we arrived at the minorities regime. And most of the commentators who settle in the interwar period and examine the minorities regime talk about the rights of peoples to self-determination as being Woodrow Wilson's pledge for peace during war. And I wondered, well, I wonder how Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea. And probing it further, it seemed to me that it was much more complex than the story that we remember.
So let's go to the paper itself, and I wonder if you could begin by just summarizing the core argument, in a nutshell. What is the argument that you're making in the paper? And then perhaps we'll go back through some of the elements of the argument.
All right. Well, there are numerous points to my argument, but in a nutshell, I think it's the title, A Rival History of Self-Determination. So if we remember one story as liberal international lawyers, that the rights of peoples to self-determination emerged as Woodrow Wilson's pledge for peace, a peace strategy in World War I, and that the story evolved through the peace treaties at Versailles in an atrophied form, so that we all agree that the form of the disappointments of Woodrow Wilson's pledge for peace were the minorities treaties that didn't succeed to secure for peoples their rights to self-determination. And that so my argument is to revisit that history and to say, well, what happened? Did it really belong to Woodrow Wilson? And is it really the story that only belongs to liberal international national lawyers? And what happened in the prior moment? So if we remember the rights to self-determination as a story after war, as Professor Berman always refers to us as our history as being après-guerre. If perhaps that our history as international lawyers, if we think of the prior moment avant-guerre or pendant-guerre, so during war or before war, and I was interested in that moment. And that if we look to that moment, that the rights to peoples to self-determination was not simply a flag of liberal peace, but similarly a flag of socialist internationalism as well.
And you take Rosa Luxemburg, as we've said, as your sort of the main figure, the heroine of your story, as it were. So perhaps you could tell us something about Luxemburg herself and her background and what makes her an interesting figure at this particular moment.
Okay, so she's part of this rival history of self-determination. So if we see it rather as a contest between during war or in the moment before the peace settlements at Versailles, as a contest between socialist internationalism and liberal internationalism, she is a voice or one of the contestants in the side of socialist internationalism. But within that side of the story, she is embedded within further contests. So I was quite interested in understanding the way in which we see history as a series of linear events or points, but they're not so linear. That each moment in time is highly contestable and mobile and can move in any direction, depending on who's got power and who wins the contest. So she's embedded in the contest amongst socialist nationalists during war, and also, but stretching right back. And it stretches a long time before liberal internationalists even really enter the story. And I was so interested in the way in which liberal internationalists didn't invent this idea of self-determination. It came from a much more surprising place.
And you are interested in her marginality. She's a sort of a marginal figure, you say,
Yes.
in several different ways. So how did her status as a marginal person or a minor person influence her thinking about self-determination?
So you did ask me before, so I might say something about Rosa Luxemburg for people who are not sure. So Rosa Luxemburg, and why I will say this is because yesterday, before I arrived here, I received an email from my friend Monica, and she said to me, "Oh, I was speechless for a minute. You're writing about Rosa Luxemburg, but is she the same person, in inverted commas?" And I thought, so we remember her, or she is remembered or has a reputation as being Red Rosa, or Rosa the servant of Tsarism, or Rosa the incendiary, that she's regarded as a radical, a terrorist, an advocate of violence, and that she is not remembered perhaps as, at least in mainstream, or for us who are not experts, she's not remembered for her fuller story. That she's rather remembered for her reputation après-guerre, after war, after the power arrangements settled, but also in her own field. She was born in 1870, and she was assassinated by former comrades in Germany on, I think, the 15th of January 1919, shortly after Armistice. So she lived in a very wild period of history, of war, of revolution. She was a Polish, she's Polish originally. She's from a very wealthy Polish bourgeoisie family. She's highly educated, and she was attracted, I suppose, partly because of her intellectual and academic training, and her experience in Poland and her observations in her youth. She was very attracted by socialist politics in Poland, and this is what led her away from Poland. So she was involved in some subversive anti-government activities, and she left and this is one of her biographers, said that she left Poland because she was engaged in illegal subversive political activities under the straw in a peasant's cart. So she left Poland in secret and then proceeded to study elsewhere and completed a PhD and ended up in Germany. And the reason she went to Germany, and you can imagine that she was multilingual, so she was truly cosmopolitan in her moment. But she ended up in Germany because Germany was the only place in Europe where it was socialism was legal. So it was legal, and there were seats in the Reichstag. She could be elected. It was possible to be elected to Parliament, although women did not have the right to be. Women did not. At that time, were not able to be elected to Parliament. So she was involved in legal socialist activities in Germany and part of the German Social Democracy, the party that had seats in the Reichstag.
So she was marginal as a woman, as a Jew, as a Pole in Germany?
Also as a bourgeois, because as you see that she spoke for workers, but she spoke from out. She wasn't a worker. She was never a worker. She was privileged. There was nothing. So she spoke for workers' rights, but she was never a worker. She spoke as a woman, marginal as a woman, marginal because she was Polish, marginal because she was Jewish.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to what she thought about self-determination. What was distinctive about her particular view on self-determination?
That's a huge question. All right, so the rights of peoples to self-determination, that I suppose in a nutshell, how we understand it, is the idea that peoples as a people, as a nation, are entitled or have a right to be recognised politically and through territorial autonomy as a people. So the rights of peoples to self-determination, we often think about this right as a right to territorial sovereignty or political sovereignty of some form. And current examples might be South Sudan, Timor-Leste. So we think about self-determination in the era of decolonisation and through that way of thinking. Similarly, in her moment, the rights of peoples to self-determination was a question for Europe. So it was a question about Europe's minorities peoples being minorities within a larger nation state, having self-determination or autonomy, political independence from a parent state. Mm-hmm. So that was the general idea, which was a long-standing issue or problem in Europe, which she said this conflict between minorities was part of, is often raised, and this is what Woodrow Wilson suggests was the reason for instability in Europe. One of the reasons giving rise to the First World War.
But she had an unorthodox view of this problem or of the solution. Certainly unorthodox compared to Wilson, to the way we think about it today. At her time, did it stand out?
Okay, so the rights of peoples to self-determination is generally agreed as a right of peoples to independence from foreign rule. So it's an idea of independence. And I think that her difference is the way in which we use self-determination, that whose interests does self-determination serve. So her views were unorthodox in that, yes, the right of peoples to self-determination could be a peace strategy, but that's not the whole story. So both both internationalisms, liberal internationalists and socialist internationalists, thought that self-determination could be a peace strategy, and thought that it should. In the socialist camp, Lenin was her main interlocutor and a proponent of the rights of peoples to self-determination. So the orthodox, if there is an orthodox line, is that it's a contest between whether or not Woodrow Wilson or Lenin owned the idea of self-determination as a peace strategy. And that mattered because whatever happened during war would determine who got to claim that right as after war, and claimed ownership as the author of that right. But her lack of orthodoxy was that, unlike Woodrow Wilson and unlike Lenin, she said, well, there's not an absolute right to self-determination, in that it exists, but we're not going. I don't want to use it. I don't want to use it. I want to think about what are the implications of using it as a peace strategy. And she said there are 2 points that she makes. She said, if self-determination is being used to reinforce an existing order of exploitation, such as in the First World War, or simply to transfer power or shift power from one order of exploitation to a new order of exploitation, which she saw as the experience in Russia, we shouldn't use the right to self-determination, that socialists should not support it. So that's her lack of orthodoxy, that she wants to raise it as a question, not as an absolute entitlement. So that she wants to think about, does the right to self-determination serve the rights of workers in this particular situation? And so her lack of orthodoxy is that it's mobile, it's not an absolute right, and that whether or not we use it as socialists, this is speaking from her perspective, depends on its consequences.
You make this very interesting argument about her attitude. So on the one hand, she's speaking on behalf of the workers.
Yes.
On the other hand, I think you argue that she's almost individualistic, and this perhaps comes from her marginality, that she takes a personal view about the problem, that is, she sort of steps back from the collective and speaks as an individual. Is that how I should understand your argument?
Well, yes, I agree with you there. However, I think her individualism is because she's so committed to workers. And perhaps this is more pronounced, or perhaps she felt this because she was marginal, or however, I think rather that is less the case than the fact that she has a great deal of courage, and that she's very much an intellectual. So she was Polish political economy was her PhD. So she's into the details, and she wasn't simply going to use political rhetoric or emotional rhetoric, which she's often associated with, to solve a problem, but she was very interested in unlacing all the details of the problem and really, really understanding them. And she was unwilling to use the broad brush, like this romantic language of self-determination, if it didn't serve the interests at stake, which she saw as workers. So she is uniformly committed to international revolution or workers' freedom. However, she always asks that question in context. And her individuality is really her courage. And her courage was to go against the mainstream line, of her leaders, Lenin and the socialist giants who surrounded her, who said the rights to self-determination. Marx says that there should be a rights of peoples to self-determination, so we agree with that. And they said that should be uniform, and she said, well, no, it's not. And that I might explain for those who are listening the two different ways in which she sees it in context. So, before this 1915 pamphlet, that the Junius brochure that I analyse in my paper, that there is a long story of contest between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and other socialists, particularly in Russia but also in Germany, about when self-determination should be a socialist strategy. And she said that if that self-determination is used for reformist ends rather than revolutionary ends, that it should not be supported. And what she means by that is, if self-determination is simply about getting freedom from one regime and the imposition of exploitation by a new regime of workers, well, then we shouldn't support it. And her example was Russia, because that was the petri dish for this idea in the 20 years before the First World War. And as you all would know, that Russia was Tsarist, so it was a feudal agrarian economy, and she saw that there was exploitation in this order, but it was a form of exploitation that was led by the Tsar, and the economy that revolved around this medieval feudal agrarian economy. And she said that freedom from the Tsar would simply, if self-determination of the people from Tsarist domination in Poland, which was her area of Poland was under Tsarist occupation, would simply shift to exploitation by an order ruled by capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
So
but now Polish capitalists.
Yes, so Polish capitalists. So she said, well, where are workers in all this? Well, we were dominated previously or exploited by a foreign order of exploitation. But if we support self-determination in this context, in Poland, we are simply going to have a new exploitative order of capitalists, of imperialists, of bourgeoisie, and nothing really changes for workers. So she says that's kind of a reform, but it's not a revolution. And what I wanted, it distracts us from the tasks of international revolution. So that's her lack of orthodoxy in that story. Now, in the First World War, her idea of self-determination arrives in a very different way. So again, she wants to look at the question in its particular setting, and her question always is, are the interests of workers served by the rhetoric of self-determination? Is self-determination simply serving the interests of domination by an order of exploitation? And she says that during war, the Reichstag talked about the First World War as a war of self-defense, that it was a nationalistic war, that it was necessary to defend the homeland. And in this case, that socialists who sat in parliament in the Reichstag decided to vote with the ruling party, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, in order to defend the interests of the homeland. And she said that, Rosa Luxemburg said that this was a capitulation of workers to the interests of the capital order. So in that case, that workers' interests were not served. That she said, yes, we must protect peoples from invasion, but this war was an imperialistic war. It was a war between European powers, imperialistic capitalist powers, and that drawing in workers in order to support a capitalist war, and to use the language of self-determination was a wrong usage of that phrase. And who suffered because the socialists voted with the ruling party in the Reichstag? It was workers, because workers were the soldiers. And so it was workers who died, it was workers who suffered in the battlefields. And her pamphlet that I talk about is very emotive, that it's workers who were injured by the vote, by the unity in the Reichstag between socialists and capitalists.
So you've been talking about sort of Rosa Luxemburg's approach and how it shifts slightly at different times, before the war, after the war, or during the war rather. So that, I think, brings us to another topic, which is the sort of questions of methodology, which are woven throughout the paper. And it seems to me, and you may have a different view, but it seems to me that you're making two arguments about methodology, or 2 points rather. One is that by revisiting Luxemburg and her views at that moment, we defatalize the concept of self-determination as it emerged after the war in the Wilsonian formulation, and as that sort of devolved and degraded over time. But secondly, you seem to be making an argument that Luxemburg herself adopted a sort of a novel historical methodology that we can learn from as international lawyers. So at one point you say, her methods remain suggestive for the methods pursued by contemporary international legal thought because she rediscovers the concepts past for her present. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about those two methodological points and how they relate to each other.
All right, so I will tell a story, and this is a story about how I came to Rosa Luxemburg, and it might help put those 2 points together. So when I was preparing this paper, it was the same time that I was teaching international law for the first time to undergraduate students. And one of the teaching tools that I used was this amazing timeline that's published by OUP online. And it's a line, and it has a whole series of events going back to, I don't know, the 10th century to our present. And it has all these pinpoints. Have you seen it? Yes. And this timeline is wonderful because it pops up with a box if you press at a particular point on the timeline, and tells you what happens. So that international law, as others have, the story of international law or the history of international law, as many other scholars have described, is a history of events or moments. And it seemed to me that this is linear, and it's visibly linear in this form, and that we remember international law through a treaty or an armistice or a gathering, a conference, or the outbreak of war, or some kind of event. And it seemed to me to be so clean and perfect. And I just realized that perhaps it wasn't so settled, that perhaps that in each of these moments that there was something else happening, that it was a lot messier than what this timeline looked like. So I was very interested in, if we understand ourselves always, as Professor Berman says, après-guerre, after war, and we track these dots or points on a linear line, what would happen before war? And are these points before war messier than these perfectly formed moments? And Rosa Luxemburg cracks open for me these pinpoints on the linear timeline, because she shows me that in her moment, as well as Lenin's moment, as well as Woodrow's moment, that these moments are way more mobile and can go in different directions. And that this is because in each moment there are a range of voices coalescing and talking to each other and arguing and vying for power and domination. So one way of understanding, revising the story of that we are as international lawyers after war is to understand that there's that before these pinpoints there are other things happening, and that in those other moments that they are way more mobile and contestable than we could possibly imagine.
So throughout the article you engage with some international lawyers and some international historians.
Yes.
And sort of distinguish your view from theirs. And is that the key difference, that they are looking after war, they're looking at the power as it is established? Sometimes you talk about an alternative, somebody else's methodology as genealogies of power, and you distinguish your view from that. So yes. You're suggesting that what they are tracing is as things turned out when the order settled,
yes.
but you're interested in what happens before the order settles.
Yes, so Hannah Arendt in her essay or her biographical essay about Rosa Luxemburg says that history is often remembered through the falls and the triumphs of great men, and it's sort of the achievements and or these big moments in history. And so after war is, so war, who won the war? The liberal internationalists won the First World War and settled the terms of peace at Versailles, so that our story of international law becomes the story of those characters.
So lastly, perhaps you could say something about how this project, this paper, fits into your larger scholarly agenda. You have a number of references throughout the paper to Hannah Arendt, and you've written elsewhere about her. So is that what brought you to this topic?
I find that my teachers about law are not necessarily lawyers, and that my research always begins intuitively. So you said, where does this paper come from? It always comes for me from an intuitive, instinctive place, a feeling that something that I'm told, a story I read is not quite right, or it feels right, or somebody says something that makes sense, and that the figures that make sense to me are those political theorists or philosophers often say something that may alert me to some discomfort or some calm I feel about my discipline, and that they shine a bright light on a problem for me. And so Hannah Arendt is one of those people, and I wrote my PhD about Hannah Arendt and her particular experience of biopolitics in her moment. And so, yes, so she teaches me lots. And she wrote about a biographical essay about Rosa Luxemburg. And it seems to me that Hannah Arendt is often misunderstood, or people refer to her and think they know her, that they regard her as conservative, or they regard her as something particular. And yet Arendt, in her biographical essay, writes about Luxemburg, who was not her contemporary, and Hannah Arendt generally talks about her contemporaries, but really Luxemburg was not, and she is extraordinarily taken with Rosa Luxemburg. And this seems to me quite similar to the way Hannah Arendt is often misunderstood. That how could it be that a liberal, a conservative thinker such as Hannah Arendt, if she is so, which I don't think she is at all, I think she is far more individualistic and her own character, how could she be intrigued by a woman who, as my friend Monica says, is this the same person, a radical terrorist, an advocate of violence? And so I was very interested in reading and exploring Luxemburg in order to understand Arendt, and she introduced me to the story. But Hannah Arendt teaches me that our moments in time are not set, and that when we catastrophize, or settle, or find ourselves mired in a particular version of a moment in time, we lose the opportunity. We lose two things. We forget that we are responsible, even if we weren't there. We are responsible for how that moment is remembered, and we're also responsible. We lose an opportunity for shaping what comes next. So Hannah Arendt, in her experience of the world and the horrors of history, wants to understand these moments as not wells in which we disappear in sorrow, but rather moments and openings to other possibilities. And that's the grandeur of her optimism, this mobility of these sad times, and that if we realise that we are responsible, when we can move them forward. And that is how Rosa Luxemburg and Hannah Arendt fit together for me, because Luxemburg is so invested in a less conscious way. She doesn't think about responsibility for she doesn't use the words of responsibility and reshaping futures as Arendt does, but she is so invested in this moment of recognising that something is not settled but rather mobile and contestable, and we can change it. She's so invested in her future that she invites us to think about history that way, but also to think about ourselves that way, that our moment is mobile, that we are completely shifting and able to change and have some kind of autonomy over how we experience the past, but also how we experience the present and the future.
Wonderful. So your PhD on Hannah Arendt is coming out also with Oxford University Press in the next year?
Thank you for asking. Yes, I will. I am working on my final revisions for my book, but yes, it is a great joy to be able to settle with Arendt. And Rosa Luxemburg was really a diversion, who I come to through Arendt, and I will go back to Arendt now and think about her a little more.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us on Eagle Live about your paper on Rosa Luxemburg. And hopefully this conversation has whet our audience's appetite for more. They'll go to find your article, which is freely available now on Eagle's website. And of course, hopefully while they're there, they can subscribe and read some other articles on Eagle. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.